Despite his growing popularity, the mainstream press continues to attack Bernie Sanders and pretend like he has no support. If you can't tell, these stories are wearing on me. I'm getting tired of doing stories like this, but this kind of misinformation has to be covered. Whether it's MSNBC or the New York Times or CNN or whoever, they have a massive reach. So when there is misinformation put out there by any of these massive outlets, they're going to have an impact on people that are consuming that content. So first off, this clip is more of a, I don't know, something to laugh at, but I just want to show you the question that this reporter puts on Bernie Sanders and how Bernie completely turns it around and shuts him down. Watch.
Really want change. Vote for somebody who comes from the working class, not a billionaire, who understands working class issues, is going to stand up and fight for the working class.
That's it, we'll let you go. Your polling numbers here in Iowa have gone down a little bit.
No, you're looking at one poll which the media seems to like to talk about.
And so how did Bernie Sanders rise to the top of the polls here in Iowa?
Actually, if you look at the reports of polling since the last debate, guess which candidate has gone up the most? Thank you very much.
All right. Now, look, if you haven't paid attention at all to the press coverage that Bernie is getting, you may think, why was Bernie being so mean to that nice little man? Here's the reality. Whether it's MSNBC or CNN or whoever it is, they are continuing to frame Bernie Sanders as somebody who is losing support, somebody who is speaking to no one, as you're going to see from a New York Times article I'll show you in a minute. But in fact, the opposite is true. So as Bernie mentioned in that clip, he is the one that gained the most since the second debate. So looking at this Reuters poll that has tracked this, Bernie Sanders rose more than anybody else in the polls after the second debate. So his support went up by 2%. Biden's there, you can see, went up a little bit. I don't know how. Don't ask me to explain why Biden continued to have support. Yeah, we'll get to that in another video. Elizabeth Warren dropped a bit. Kamala Harris dropped a lot. The only person that really comes close to gaining as much support from the second debate as Bernie did is Cory Booker. But even he didn't match the amount of the gain that Bernie saw from that second debate. And another point here is, so while that's never mentioned in the press, obviously, they also don't mention how well Bernie polls against Donald Trump. So there's a new poll from Survey USA showing that Bernie is a +8 against Donald Trump. And this is the 15th straight poll that shows Bernie defeating Trump. Now, I'll link to that poll below the video so you can look into the numbers yourself. It'll be a Daily Beast article. But let me get to the real piece here. This article from the New York Times, it's one of many. And I'm going to get into the writer of this piece as well. That will give you an indication as to why these sorts of articles are going out there. But as you see here, the New York Times tweets out, most presidential candidates use the 10-day Iowa State Fair to showcase their retail campaigning skills, but Bernie Sanders spoke to almost no one. Now, I'm not going to break down the entire article. For one, I don't want to give this person more attention than they actually deserve. But, I mean, this is just... this piece is so thick with misinformation that it's going to become clear as to why this article was written when I get into the writer of this piece. But first, let's just address the main point here. Oh, Bernie Sanders spoke to almost no one. He had almost no support in Iowa. What's going on here? Let's start small. So this Iowa Politics website, Iowa Starting Line, tweets out here over the weekend. The crowd gets ready for Bernie Sanders' time on stage at the state fair. This appears to be the most candidate signs we've had at a soapbox event so far. And then this tweet, once Bernie hit the stage, saying Bernie takes the soapbox stage to maybe the largest audience yet at this state fair. And here's another angle of that crowd. You can see it's a massive crowd. But I mean, that's just, using your eyeballs, right? You can't really count the people there. Let's look at some actual data on the ground. Who has the most individual donors in Iowa? Looking at data from, funny enough, the New York Times, shows you that Bernie Sanders, by far, it's not even close, has the most support in Iowa. He dominates Iowa, not to mention dominates the rest of the country, but he definitely dominates Iowa here. Yet, is that the headline? Are you seeing headlines from CNN, the New York Times, Washington Post, whoever it is? Are you seeing them have stories where they're focused on, look at how much support Bernie has on the ground in Iowa. In fact, look how much support he has all across the country. He almost doubles the amount of individual donors that the second place candidate Elizabeth Warren has. Are you seeing stories about this? No. So the New York Times put out this data, but there aren't separate stories saying, oh my, look how amazing Bernie Sanders is doing with individual donors. That is not going out there. They are not publishing that because they are pushing a particular narrative, as I'm going to show you in a minute. But there's also this data here. So that map from the New York Times, that data is from June 30th. There is some updated data. So this from ABC News campaign reporter Adam Kessley says, the Bernie Sanders campaign announces it has 850,000 donors and is approaching 2.5 million donations. So in the data from June 30th, Bernie was at 746,000 individual donors. Now he's at 850. And again, it's increasing. Nobody comes close to his numbers. This is a candidate of the people. That's who is supporting him. Grassroots support, volunteers, individual donors, real people are supporting his campaign. He is taking no billionaire money. He's one of the only candidates that has no support from any billionaires at all. I did a whole other video on this, but just off the top of my head, I remember Pete Buttigieg has, I think, 23 billionaire donors. Pete Buttigieg. Kamala Harris is also in the top 5. Biden's also in the top 5. So understand here, this is a candidate of the people, and his support in Iowa is real. Now, let's get to the writer of this New York Times piece, Sydney Embers. So there is a great expose on her in Fair. I'm going to read the headline here. Sydney Embers, Secret Sources. New York Times reporter hides corporate ties of Sanders critics she highlights. This is a piece from Katie Halper. Now, before I read it, understand here, Fair is a well-respected site, and this article goes deep. So I'm going to link to the article below the video. It's impossible for me to, quote the entire thing, but there are countless examples of how Sydney Embers is construing or is basically not giving you all the information when she is, for example, quoting certain sources that are attacking Bernie Sanders. So let me get a little more into this. Ember came to the New York Times with a resume limited to the finance industry. She was an analyst for BlackRock, the biggest global investment management corporation and the largest investor in coal plant developers in the world. Her husband, Mike Bacek, is also in the investment business. He was a senior associate consultant at Bain Capital, where his father was CEO. Ember was hired by the Times in 2014 to cover advertising and marketing for the paper's business vertical DealBook. She started covering politics in May 2018 and immediately got the enviable assignment of covering one of the leading contenders for the 2020 Democratic nomination, Bernie Sanders. Brad Johnson, a political analyst with a background in climate science, pointed out that Ember quoted a source without mentioning that she's a corporate lobbyist. Journalist Zed Jelani noted that Ember failed to disclose that another source was a senior advisor for a Hillary Clinton super PAC. Education scholar Diane Ravitch devoted a blog post to the reporter's shameful reporting on Sanders' education policy, questioning the authority of her sources. Now, these are just 3 examples. If you go to that link, again, I link it below the video. If you go to that link, it's endless. This person was hired to attack Bernie Sanders. The person hired to cover the Bernie Sanders campaign was hired from the finance industry. Didn't cover politics at all until last year. And she has the job of covering one of the leading contenders in the race. And it just so happens all of her pieces on Bernie Sanders are attacks. Come on. So, like, what bothers me is that they understand that anybody questioning this will immediately sound like they're being conspiratorial. Oh, you just don't like how Bernie's being covered. Oh, well, you're just being conspiratorial. But if you look at the facts, I mean, imagine the New York Times hired a socialist to cover Joe Biden. That's the equivalent of this. Imagining that happening is impossible. That would never happen. The New York Times, first of all, how many socialists do they even have on staff? But having a socialist cover the Joe Biden campaign would never happen. Yet here they are hiring somebody who is incredibly wealthy from the finance industry, didn't even cover politics till 2018, and she's covering the Bernie Sanders campaign. Bernie Sanders obviously is challenging capitalism, challenging the existing system that benefits the people at the top, like the writer of this piece.